The door slammed behind me as Whitney, my daughter-in-law, called over her shoulder. "Eat in the garage. Our guests can't stand the smell of old people." Still, I stayed frozen, the words sinking in like a dagger. As I stepped into the garage, the scent of dust and old memories filled my lungs. While they partied inside, I realized she thought she could push me aside. That's when I called the agent. I sold the house I paid for. Let her explain to them why the party was canceled. Let her explain why it's no longer hers. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Nancy adjusted the hem of her navy dress in the mirror, taking a moment to smooth it down. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, like something she'd once worn, years ago. She hadn't dressed up for anything in so long, and tonight she felt both too much and not enough. Her reflection, polished but slightly out of place, stared back at her, and she tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. The sound of laughter drifted down the hallway, a reminder that the party had already begun. Nancy hesitated for a moment, and just as she was about to head toward the door, Whitney appeared in the doorway with a wide, rehearsed smile. "You're looking great. Come on in. Everyone's waiting." Whitney's voice was filled with that overzealous energy Nancy had come to know too well. But before she could follow, Whitney's hand landed lightly on her arm. "Actually, we set you up out back. Some of our friends are, sensitive to older smells." The words were so casual, so quick, that Nancy almost didn't process them at first. But the meaning settled in her chest. A lump of ice. Older smells. As if Nancy was something that needed to be hidden away, tucked out of sight, away from those who might find her. Unpleasant. Nancy nodded, her throat tight, as Whitney hurried off into the crowd, leaving her to make her way to the back door. It was better to avoid confrontation, she thought. Better to just go along with it. The cold night air hit her as she stepped into the garage. It was small and cramped, just big enough to hold a car and some clutter. There, next to the old boxes and a forgotten lawnmower, was a folding table. A space heater hummed weakly beside it, barely keeping the chill at bay. It wasn't much, a setup designed not to be seen, not to be noticed. Nancy sat down, the chair creaking under her weight. She picked up her fork, though she wasn't hungry. Her hand trembled slightly as she brought it to her lips, chewing mechanically. From the other side of the garage door, she could hear the clink of wine glasses, the easy laughter, the chatter of people who belonged inside. But she wasn't part of that world anymore. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Nancy ate alone, her eyes fixed on the table. Her thoughts swirled, each one darker than the last. How had it come to this? She had been part of this life once. She had been in the mix, in the crowd. But now, she was the woman left behind. The woman who needed to be kept at arm's length, as if she were some sort of contamination. The back door creaked open, and Nancy didn't need to look up to know who it was. Ava's footsteps echoed across the concrete, and then she was standing beside Nancy, her eyes soft with something Nancy couldn't name. Sympathy, maybe, or guilt. "You shouldn't let her do this," Ava said quietly, her voice full of quiet conviction. Nancy's shoulders slumped. She kept her gaze lowered, not wanting to see the pity in Ava's eyes. "She already did," she whispered, a bitter edge in her voice. There was no going back, no way to undo what had been done. Ava hesitated, as if she might say more, but then the moment passed. She turned, walking back toward the house, the door closing softly behind her. Nancy didn't move. The cold of the garage seemed to press in on her, suffocating her with its quiet. The warmth of the space heater did nothing to dispel the chill in her bones. She sat there for a long time, the weight of it all settling on her like a shroud. Nancy sat at the kitchen table, the documents spread out in front of her like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. She had known something wasn't right, but now, as she sifted through the papers, the truth settled like a heavy stone in her chest. The deed to the house. Her name was still at the top. Not Whitney's, not Ava's, just hers. She had never transferred ownership. She'd never intended to. Had only let them live here, quietly relinquishing her role without ceremony. She could still remember the day Whitney first asked to move in. It had seemed harmless. The kind of thing friends did when life got complicated. But now it felt like something much darker. Nancy pushed the stack of paperwork aside, her hand resting on her forehead. She wasn't angry, just exhausted. She should have done something sooner. She should have fought for what was hers, but she hadn't. And now all she could do was watch as they took everything from her piece by piece. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. Jordan Keyes. He had helped her with the house when she'd first bought it. The line rang once, twice, and then his voice came through, smooth and professional as always. Jordan Keyes, how can I help you? It's Nancy Walker, she said, her voice tight. I need to talk about the house, the one on Elmwood. There was a brief silence before Jordan responded. Of course, Nancy. I've got that property in my records. What can I do for you? I just want to confirm something, she said, her fingers tapping nervously against the table. I still own 100% of the property, right? Another pause. This time, Nancy could hear Jordan flipping through his notes, his voice cautious. Yes, you are still the sole owner. Relief washed over her, sharp and sudden. She let the tension slip from her shoulders. Can we list it quietly? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Without anyone knowing, no signs, no open houses, just a private listing. Absolutely. We can handle it discreetly, Jordan confirmed, his tone professional but warm. I'll set things up and get back to you soon. Nancy exhaled, the weight lifting off her chest, if only slightly. Thanks, Jordan. I appreciate it. She hung up the phone, staring at the table for a moment, her thoughts swirling. The house was still hers, but that didn't mean it felt like home anymore. It was just a place, a shell that had been hollowed out by time and by people who had never belonged. A few hours later, Nancy moved through the house with a quiet determination. She wasn't making a spectacle of it, wasn't drawing attention to her actions. She was simply packing, methodically and efficiently, the way she had done for years. Her hands moved over objects, books, old records, photos, and she placed them in boxes, one after the other. Each item was a fragment of a life she no longer recognized. She paused only once, glancing at a photo frame on the shelf. It was from a trip she had taken with Whitney to Cape Cod, the sun setting behind them, both of them smiling. That smile, that connection, where had it gone? Whitney had changed, and so had Nancy. What had once been friendship had turned into something else, something distant, something cold. The sound of Whitney's voice broke through the silence. Nancy's heart skipped a beat as she overheard her talking loudly to a friend in the next room. We'll redo the backyard next year, Whitney said, her tone full of pride. This place is basically ours now. The words hit Nancy like a slap. Her grip on the box tightened. This place is basically ours now. Whitney's claim had never been official. It had never been signed, never been agreed upon. But somehow, Whitney had made it hers, and Nancy had let her. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She kept packing, moving without pause. She couldn't afford to waste time on anger, on regret. Instead, she focused on the work. Each item she packed was a step closer to reclaiming what was hers. The house had never truly been Whitney's. It had never belonged to anyone but Nancy. And now, she would take it back. As the last box filled, Nancy's gaze lingered on the door to the backyard. She could almost hear the laughter, the clinking of glasses, but that was their world, not hers. She turned back to the boxes, her resolve hardening. It's time to end this. The sound of the back door creaked open again, but Nancy didn't turn. The weight of what was coming, the confrontation, the truth, pressed on her chest. She wasn't ready, but she had no choice. She would face them. It was time to stop pretending. Nancy sat in her office, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room, as she clicked through the final steps of listing the house. It was almost surreal, like she was operating on autopilot, each motion driven by something beyond her control. She had reached a decision, and now there was no going back. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she filled out the form for a private pre-market listing. The words felt heavy. Every click seemed to seal something she could never undo. Sale price, listing terms, no public open houses. She added the request for absolute discretion, a silent plea that the world outside wouldn't know what she was doing until it was too late. The house would be sold, and it would be hers again, if only for a fleeting moment. The confirmation email arrived in her inbox with an almost ominous finality. It was done. The house, the life she had once shared with Whitney, would be gone. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. The weight of it settled across her shoulders, heavier than anything she had anticipated. There had been no turning back, not after Whitney's casual words about this place being ours now. But now it was out of her hands. A few hours later, Nancy stood in the driveway, watching Ava load boxes into her car. It was strange, this secretive movement of her life. Boxes that once filled the shelves with memories, now packed tightly in the back of a nondescript SUV, all heading toward an anonymous storage unit. The kind of place no one would ever look for her. Ava helped without asking questions, moving silently, efficiently. They didn't talk much. There was nothing left to say. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were sharp with concern. "You sure this is what you want?" Ava asked, her voice low as she helped Nancy slide the last box into the trunk. Nancy nodded, her gaze distant. "It's done. There's nothing left to discuss." Ava paused for a moment, studying her. "You're not doing this out of spite, right? You're not hurting yourself just to hurt her?" Nancy felt a tight knot form in her chest at the question. Was she? Maybe, but it didn't matter now. This was the only way to take control, to stop feeling like a spectator in her own life. Ava didn't press further, just gave her a silent nod before getting into the car and pulling out of the driveway. Nancy watched her drive off, the car disappearing down the street. She turned back toward the house, a quiet resignation settling over her. It was almost time. The next day, Melissa, the attorney who had helped Nancy set up the sale paperwork, arrived with the final documents. She was efficient, professional, everything Nancy needed right now. Melissa laid the papers down in front of her, her pen hovering over the signature line. "Everything's in order," Melissa said, her voice calm but with an underlying tension. "You've made the right choice, Nancy. You'll be free of this once it's signed." Nancy's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the pen. The motion felt so final, so irrevocable. But there was no hesitation in her mind. The house would be sold, the ownership transferred, and Whitney's hold over it would be erased. This was the clean break Nancy needed. She signed. The loop was closed. A few days later, Jordan called with news. A serious buyer had emerged, someone who wanted to close in 30 days, all cash. No conditions, no waiting, no second chances. The deal was as solid as it could get. But Nancy had one request. "No showings until after the event," she said, her voice steady. "I want it off the market until then. I don't want Whitney getting any ideas. Not until it's done." Jordan didn't hesitate. "Understood. We'll honor your terms." As Nancy hung up, a sense of finality settled over her. The house, the place where it all had started, would soon belong to someone else. She would no longer be trapped in the memory of what had once been. Meanwhile, Whitney was busy making plans of her own. Her phone rang constantly, friends and influencers, all demanding details for the big event she had been planning for weeks. It was supposed to be the party of the year, an extravagant affair, the kind of thing that would cement her place in the social scene. Everything had to be perfect. "We'll redo the backyard next year, but for now, this is going to be incredible," Whitney told a friend, her voice brimming with excitement. "This place is basically ours now. Everyone will know it." But Whitney didn't know what was coming. She didn't know how close she was to losing it all, to losing the illusion that the house had ever truly belonged to her. Nancy watched from the window as Whitney paced across the backyard, making plans, arranging details. But Nancy had made her own plans, and this time she would be the one in control. It was almost time. Whitney stood in the living room, giving a final glance over the menu, the floral arrangements, and the valet service waiting outside. Everything had to be perfect. It was the night she had been planning for months, the party of the year, the one that would solidify her status. Her eyes scanned the decorations again, making sure every detail was in place. The flowers were fresh, the lighting just right. She was no stranger to the pressure of hosting grand events, but tonight it felt more significant. This was her chance to cement her place in the social scene. This house was hers, wasn't it? Everything has to be perfect, she muttered to herself as she glanced at her phone, checking the time. Cameron, seated at the kitchen island, barely looked up from his phone. "Just stay out of the way, Mom," he said, his tone flat. Whitney stiffened but didn't react. She had more important things to focus on. The party was about to begin, and she needed everything to be flawless. Everything will be perfect. I've earned this, she thought, the weight of the night's expectations pressing down on her. In the upstairs bathroom, Nancy applied a coat of lipstick, her fingers shaking slightly as she gazed at her reflection. The woman in the mirror felt like a stranger, someone she barely recognized. She tried to smile, but the movement felt forced, like she was going through the motions. She glanced at her phone once more. Jordan's message flashed across the screen. The house was officially his. She had signed the paperwork, and now it was only a matter of time before Whitney would know. Nancy had already made her decision. It was done. Stepping away from the mirror, Nancy exhaled deeply, trying to steady her pulse. She wasn't sure what she expected from tonight. Maybe nothing at all, but she had done what she had. 2. She had kept her distance, kept her emotions in check. Now it was time to leave it all behind. She walked down the stairs and out the front door. The night air was cool against her skin, but the weight of what she had done left her feeling warm in a way she didn't expect. Jordan's car waited at the curb, and as she approached, he stepped out, offering a small nod in greeting. "You're here," Nancy said, her voice steady. "All set," Jordan replied. "We'll finalize everything in a few days. Just a matter of timing now." Nancy nodded, the finality of it settling deeper into her bones. She had made her choice. She had done what was necessary. The house was as good as gone. Back inside, Ava stood at the kitchen counter, watching as her grandmother handed over the keys to Whitney. It was a small but symbolic gesture, one that had always been routine, but today, the weight of it felt heavier than ever. Ava watched silently, unsure of what to say, but understanding the finality of the action. Meanwhile, the guests had started to arrive, unaware that the home they had come to admire now legally belonged to someone else. The laughter and chatter filled the air, and Whitney beamed as she greeted her friends. To them, it was all part of the fantasy she had crafted. She called out to her guests, her voice carrying through the crowded room. "This house is everything we dreamed of," she said, raising her glass for a toast. "It's perfect, everything we deserve." The guests cheered, their applause ringing out in support of her words, but to Nancy, the sentiment felt hollow. Whitney was still playing the role she had so carefully created, the woman who had everything, who belonged in this world. But Nancy knew the truth. The house wasn't Whitney's. It never had been. Nancy stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the spectacle unfold. She hadn't let the lie break her. In fact, it felt good, almost liberating, to be the one who knew the truth. Whitney's empire was crumbling without her even knowing it. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the echoes of Whitney's triumphant words surrounded Nancy. But they couldn't touch her. She had already made her escape. It was done. And as the celebration continued inside, Nancy made her way out the door, the weight of the house, the weight of everything, lifting off her shoulders. This was the last night they'd pretend. Whitney stood in the center of the living room, scanning the scene with an air of perfection. The music was at the right volume, the drinks were flowing, and the floral arrangements were impeccable. Every detail of the party had been carefully curated, just as she had imagined. Tonight, she would be the star. This was her moment to shine. This was her house, her life. She had worked hard for this. Her fingers lightly brushed over her glass as she surveyed the room, a satisfied smile tugging at her lips. The house was hers, and the guests surrounding her made sure to make her feel that way. Whitney had a place in this world, and she was going to savor every second of it. The doorbell rang, its tone sharp and out of place in the otherwise smooth atmosphere. Whitney didn't immediately react, assuming it was a late arrival. She waved it off, continuing her conversation with a guest. But when the doorbell rang a second time, it sent a ripple of unease through her. Without breaking her stride, she excused herself and made her way to the door. But when she opened it, The sight was not what she expected. Melissa stood there, her expression impassive, her hands holding a legal-sized envelope. The party noise seemed to fade as Whitney's gaze fixed on the woman who had been part of her life, but never a true ally. "I need to speak with you," Melissa said, her tone businesslike. There was no warmth, no pleasantries. She was here for a purpose. Whitney's throat tightened. "Not now," she said, her voice shaky. "It's the party, the event. This isn't the time for whatever." "This is the time, Whitney," Melissa interrupted, handing her the envelope. The weight of the paper felt too heavy in Whitney's hands. "Official notice of sale. The property is no longer yours." Whitney froze, her face draining of color. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The crowd inside, oblivious to the exchange, continued their laughter and chatter, but the air around Whitney had thickened, suffocating. The buyer, an unfamiliar man in a sharp suit, appeared behind Melissa, his demeanor polite but firm. He stepped forward, breaking the silence with practiced ease. "I'm afraid the event is over," he said, his words cool. "The property now belongs to me. The party is officially concluded." There was a moment of stunned silence that passed through the crowd. Conversations halted mid-sentence, the guests glancing toward Whitney as the weight of what was happening sunk in. No one moved at first, until the buyer stepped forward once more. "I'll be taking possession of the house now," he continued. "Please make your way out." The shock rippled through the guests like an electric current. Whitney's breath caught in her throat. She turned to Cameron, her son, searching for some kind of reassurance, something, anything to make sense of this. But Cameron, who had been glued to his phone, didn't even look up. He remained silent. Whitney's hand trembled as she gripped the doorframe, her gaze shifting back to the buyer and Melissa. "You can't do this," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Nancy, who had been quietly waiting in the guest bathroom, stepped out into the hallway. She heard the quiet uproar and knew it was time. It had been coming for weeks, but now, standing on the threshold, it felt different. She was calm, completely calm. As she walked into the living room, the air felt different. The guests were still processing the shift in power. But Nancy knew they were only part of the story. She had already made her choice, and she was ready to face the consequences. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice smooth, her words measured. There was no drama, no flourish, just the cold finality of a decision made. "It's been a pleasure having you here." The crowd fell silent, and Whitney's head snapped in Nancy's direction, her eyes filled with disbelief. Whitney took a step forward, her voice rising with fury. You did this out of spite," she screamed. Her face flushed with anger. "This is my house. How could you—" Nancy met her gaze evenly, not a trace of emotion showing. "No," she said, cutting through the rising tension. "I did it because you forgot who paid for this roof." The words landed with devastating precision, and for a moment, Whitney stood frozen, her mouth agape. The guests, still stunned, shifted uneasily, watching the confrontation unfold. The realization hit Whitney like a blow to the chest. Her grip on the illusion she had built was slipping, unraveling in front of everyone. The house, her empire, was no longer hers. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The sound of glasses clinking and murmurs of disbelief filled the space between them. But Whitney couldn't hear it. She couldn't hear anything over the deafening silence that had settled around her. Nancy turned and walked toward the door, the weight of the moment finally lifting. She was free. And this time, Whitney wasn't going to get away with pretending. The news spread quickly, from whispers in real estate circles to headlines flashing across the internet. "Influencer evicted during own party, shocking real estate drama," the tabloids screamed. The story hit every corner of the city, fueling gossip and intrigue. The details were a spectacle. Whitney, in the midst of hosting the event of the year, had been locked out of the house she believed was hers. Nancy, however, stayed quiet. She didn't respond to calls or messages. She didn't have to. The house, the scene, the finality of it all, it was done. She had made her decision and had no desire to stir the pot any further. In the silence that followed, Ava took a step back from social media. Her profile, once full of glamorous posts from her house, now faded into oblivion. No more backyard photos, no more lifestyle content. Ava knew it was better to delete it all, to erase her connection to the house before it became too toxic. The social media world had a short memory, but it wasn't kind to the fallen. Whitney's carefully curated image was unraveling, and Ava wanted no part of it. As Whitney's public persona crumbled, the rumors started swirling. Some said she was living beyond her means, using the house as a symbol of status that had now come crashing down. Others whispered that it was a family betrayal. Either way, the truth didn't matter to her followers, only the drama, the spectacle. And Whitney's follower count began to dwindle as quickly as it had grown. Her posts, once frequent and shiny, slowed to a trickle. And when the deals with sponsors dried up, she knew it was over. Amid the noise, Cameron texted Nancy. It wasn't a surprise, but it still stung. "You ruined us." Nancy stared at the words. The accusation, as expected, wasn't about his mother's actions or his own role in the whole debacle. It was all about how he had been affected. He wasn't angry at what had happened to Whitney. He was angry at what had happened to him. Nancy didn't even need to think long before replying. "You handed me the match. I lit it." She put the phone down and took a long breath, letting the weight of the message sink in. Cameron could blame her all he wanted, but it wasn't her fault. She hadn't created this disaster. She'd just played the cards she had been dealt. A few days later, Nancy met with Melissa at a quiet cafe, the hum of the city in the background. Melissa had handled all the legalities, all the financials, and now it was time to tie up the loose ends. She slid a folder across the table with the final paperwork. "The financials are finalized," Melissa said quietly, her eyes scanning the paperwork before Nancy. "You've got enough for a small condo and 6 figures left in the bank. You're secure." Nancy looked at the papers in front of her, the numbers a stark reminder of what she had gained from the wreckage. It wasn't as much as she had dreamed of when the house was hers, but it was more than enough to start over, to leave everything behind. She signed the papers without hesitation. There was no need to wait, no need for drama. It was done. The house was no longer hers. But what she had now, this new future, was hers to create. As Nancy left the cafe, a feeling of quiet satisfaction washed over her. The chaos of the last few days had settled into something more manageable. There was still the aftermath to deal with, Cameron's text, the ongoing rumors, but she had made her escape. The house was gone, and with it, the weight of what it had come to represent. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Cameron. "I'm sorry," Nancy stared at the words for a moment. The apology felt empty, like an echo of something that could have mattered, had the timing been different, but now she didn't need it. She didn't need him. Without replying, she tucked the phone into her pocket and stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her skin. This was it. She was free. With one last look at the city around her, she walked away. Whitney's world was crumbling, but Nancy was already on her way to something new. And this time, it was her decision. The new apartment was modest, but it had something the house never had: light. The sun streamed through the windows, filling the rooms with warmth. It wasn't much: 2 small bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, and a living room that felt just a little too empty. But it was theirs. Nancy and Ava had found peace in this quiet space. The chaos of the past was far behind them, but the weight of it still lingered, an echo of everything they had lost. Ava stood by the window, looking out at the city. The stillness in her movements told Nancy everything she needed to know. Her daughter was processing the end of the life they once knew, the one they had been forced to abandon piece by piece. "This place is perfect," Nancy said, trying to fill the space between them with something light. Ava barely turned her head. "It's not much, but it's ours. It's better than the other one." Nancy watched her daughter closely. She had seen the way the house had affected her. Social media had been erased, and the pictures of their former life now felt like distant memories. The house had been the symbol of everything Whitney had wanted to project: the lifestyle, the perfection. But it wasn't real, and now Ava was starting to understand that. Nancy wasn't sure if Ava would ever fully let go of that life. It had been her home, too, but she hoped that, with time, they would both feel more free in this new beginning. The next day, a delivery arrived. A bouquet of white lilies, the kind Jordan had sent when they finalized the sale. The note was simple, just 3 words. That was legendary. Nancy smiled at the gesture. Jordan had been the steady presence throughout all of this, helping her navigate the legalities, never once questioning her choices. His message wasn't just about the sale. It was a recognition of what had happened. She had taken back control. But even as the flowers sat on the kitchen counter, another delivery came the following day. This time, it wasn't flowers. It was a message from Whitney, through Ava. "Mom, Whitney keeps trying to get in touch," Ava said, her tone flat as she showed Nancy the barrage of texts and missed calls. "She wants to talk." Nancy didn't respond immediately. There was no need to. Whitney's attempts to reach out didn't matter anymore. She was grasping at something that no longer existed. "Ava, block her," Nancy said quietly. "Let her keep trying. She'll eventually get it." Ava hesitated but nodded. She pressed the button, severing the last thread. Whitney was out of their lives now. Later that evening, the doorbell rang. Nancy hesitated before answering, sensing who it was before even looking through the peephole. Cameron stood there, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His eyes were filled with frustration, his lips pressed tight. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice tight. Nancy opened the door, but she didn't step aside. "Wait in the hallway," she said flatly. He stood there in silence, the hallway cold and silent. Nancy took a moment, letting the silence drag on. Let him feel what it was like to be left in the wake of his actions. She returned 5 minutes later, her face composed. When she saw him standing there, waiting, his impatience visible, she spoke softly, but firmly. "No," she said. Cameron's face twisted in anger, but he didn't speak. He just turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps fading as he left. Nancy didn't watch him go. She didn't need to. She had already let go. The next few weeks were quieter. Nancy went through their old things, clothes, dishes, old furniture, and started donating them to a women's shelter. It felt right, giving away pieces of their old life to those who needed them. She carried a box of old kitchenware to the shelter. As she handed it over, she realized something. She wasn't just giving away objects. She was shedding a life that had never really been hers to begin with. She walked back to the car, feeling lighter. She had made the decision. She had taken control. And she wasn't looking back. Later, as the storm clouds gathered over the city, Nancy stood by the window of their new apartment. Ava sitting on the couch behind her. There was a quiet certainty in the air. Nancy had made peace with it all. The house, the life she'd built with Whitney, it was all in the past. This was her future now, and it was hers to shape. Nancy sat across from Melissa in the small, quiet office, the air filled with the scent of fresh paper and old wood. The documents in front of her were the final pieces of the puzzle, a puzzle she'd spent weeks carefully rearranging after the house was gone. This was the closure she needed. The final, irreversible step toward reclaiming her life. Melissa pushed the papers toward her, her eyes steady, knowing the weight of this moment. "Everything is in order," she said calmly. "We just need your signatures to make it official." Nancy didn't hesitate. With a steady hand, she signed her name, each stroke deliberate. Brent and Whitney had been removed completely from her estate plan, the ties severed as cleanly as the thread that had once held them together. They were gone from her future, erased with a few swift pen strokes. Ava was named as Nancy's sole beneficiary and the executor of her estate. It was the only choice. Ava had always been the one who truly mattered, her daughter, her strength. There was no one else to consider. "The rest of your assets," Melissa continued, "are set aside for the Elder Independence and Housing Grant." "As you discussed," Nancy nodded, signing the final line. It felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders. This was her way of ensuring that something good came out of everything she'd been through. She didn't want to leave a legacy tied to bitterness or resentment. The grant was her gift to those who would need it, those who deserved it. "Done," Nancy said, looking at Melissa with quiet satisfaction. "Keep it private for now. No one needs to know, not yet." Melissa gave a simple nod, sealing the papers away in an envelope. "Understood. When you're ready, we'll make it public." Nancy felt a strange calm settle in. There would be no more noise, No more interference. She'd cut the strings, and now it was time to move forward, fully in control of her future. That evening, Nancy and Ava sat together in the apartment. The space was still sparse, but it felt like home. There was a sense of peace in the quiet hum of the city outside their window. For the first time in a long while, Nancy didn't feel the weight of expectation bearing down on her. She was free. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, drawing her attention. The screen flashed a notification. Whitney's new reel. Nancy sighed and picked it up, her stomach tightening as she saw Whitney's face fill the screen. In the video, Whitney was speaking directly to the camera, her expression one of righteous indignation. "Toxic elders," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Those who drag their families down, who cling to outdated traditions. Generational trauma ends with me." Nancy's fingers clenched around the phone as she read the caption. "Cutting toxic ties. Reclaiming my future." Ava sat across from her, watching the video with a mix of disgust and apathy. "She really can't stop," Ava muttered. "She's still playing the victim." Nancy set the phone down with a quiet exhale. "Let her. She can spin whatever story she wants. It doesn't matter anymore." Ava's eyes met hers, understanding in the silence that passed between them. Whitney's followers would probably lap it up. More drama, more attention. But it had nothing to do with them anymore. They were no longer part of her story. The next morning, Nancy took a deep breath as she went through the motions of a normal day. But she couldn't shake the quiet satisfaction that had settled in. She had made her choices. The house, the life with Whitney and Brent. It was all gone. She had her peace now, and she was going to protect it. A few days passed, and there was still no word from Cameron. Nancy hadn't expected him to come around again, but a small part of her felt the absence. She'd loved him once, but that love was swallowed up by everything else, by the weight of his silence, by his unwillingness to see the truth. But as the weeks went by, she realized she didn't need his apology. She didn't need anything from him. Nancy and Ava were free. They were finally in control of their lives, and nothing, not even Whitney's desperate attempts to remain relevant, could take that away. The future was theirs, and it was going to be better than anything that had come before. Nancy sat at the kitchen table, the cold shine of the notarized legal documents reflecting the dim light from the overhead bulb. The envelope that held them seemed insignificant, but she knew better. This was it. No more loose ends, no more disputes, no more unfinished business. The finality of it hit her as she opened the envelope, scanning the documents that officially sealed her decisions. Everything was in order, flawless, as promised. Melissa had made sure of that. She had sent everything over in a thick, clear file, watertight, unassailable. Brent's lawyer had likely already seen the contents by now, and she knew exactly what the reaction would be: withdrawal. The lawsuit he'd once threatened to bring had fizzled before it even started. This was the last move they'd get from him. His silence was the final surrender. She took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders slowly ease as she folded the papers and placed them back in the envelope. This was it. Nothing more to say, nothing more to do. She would keep her promises to herself, to Ava, and to no one else. A few hours later, Ava handed Nancy a thin envelope, one she'd mailed herself from a nearby post office. It was a simple note, one line, but the weight of it hung heavy. Nancy unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words. "This is why people don't come home." It was short, direct, and unmistakably final. The letter wasn't for her. It was for Whitney and Brent. Ava had made her decision too, her own closure tucked in that single line. Nancy ran her fingers over the edges of the note before folding it again, her heart aching with the knowledge that her daughter had found her own way to process the wreckage. They had both been hurt by people who couldn't or wouldn't see the truth, but now they were on the other side of it, free. The next morning, the phone rang again. Nancy glanced at it before letting it go to voicemail. Whitney. It had been weeks since the last attempt. She had tried calling several times, leaving messages that sounded increasingly desperate. This time, there was an email too. Whitney had apparently been trying to contact the press, to clear the air about the situation, to tell her side of the story. She was still playing the role of the victim, of course, But now no one was interested. No one cared enough to listen. Nancy wasn't surprised. People had moved on. Whitney's manufactured reality had run its course, and the world was already distracted by the next big thing. There was nothing left for Whitney to latch onto, and Nancy knew that the more she tried to grab attention, the less she would get. She deleted the message without reading it, just as she had done with the others. There was nothing left to gain from engaging with the past. It was over, for all of them. Later that week, Nancy sat quietly in the back row of a community center auditorium, listening as a panel on housing equity discussed ways to address the rising cost of living and the systemic barriers faced by seniors in the community. She wasn't there to speak. She wasn't there to make a statement. She was there because she wanted to learn, to see how people with real experience were working to make changes. As she sat in the shadows, watching the passionate panelists, Nancy thought about how far she had come. She had been part of the system for so long, trapped in the wealth and the glamour of the life she thought she wanted. But now, watching these people discuss issues that truly mattered, she felt like she was in the right place, doing the right thing. The following week, Nancy signed up to volunteer at a local senior resource group, a place dedicated to helping older adults maintain their independence. It wasn't much, just a few hours each week, answering phones, sorting donations. But it felt right. It felt like a step towards something more meaningful, something that mattered beyond the glitz and the fake promises of the past. The elderly woman she met on her first day was full of stories about how she had once lived in a grand house, full of people who promised to take care of her. Now she was fighting just to keep her apartment. As they talked, Nancy felt a deeper understanding settle in. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't about what people had or didn't have. It was about dignity. For the first time in a long time, Nancy felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. And as she left the resource center that evening, her heart lighter than it had been in years, Nancy knew something else. This was the kind of home she'd been searching for all along. The future was hers to shape, and she wasn't looking back anymore. Nancy sat in the soft glow of the studio lights, the hum of the camera equipment around her almost soothing in its rhythm. Ava sat beside her, her presence a silent but powerful comfort. They were there for the interview, but neither had expected it to happen so soon. The documentary team had reached out a few weeks ago, and now here they were, on camera. The interviewer, a woman in her late 30s with kind eyes, sat across from them, clipboard in hand. She'd asked Nancy for an anonymous interview at first, a way to tell her story without bringing more attention to the family drama. But now, as they sat in the sterile yet warm environment of the studio, Nancy realized how much of herself she had already revealed through the decisions she had made, through the quiet act of walking away from everything. The crew was small, the setup simple. Ava had insisted on being there, and Nancy was grateful for it. They both knew the importance of their voices, especially now that they had found the strength to speak, to be heard. "Why don't we start with the basics?" the interviewer said, her voice gentle. "Could you tell us a little about how you ended up here, about how you reached this point?" Nancy looked at Ava, then back to the camera. She had practiced this in her mind, but saying the words out loud felt different. It felt final. Ava's hand brushed hers, a silent reminder of their shared journey, and Nancy began. "It wasn't one moment. It wasn't one event," Nancy said softly. "It was a series of realizations. I was stuck in a life that wasn't mine, pretending to be part of something that didn't belong to me. And when the house was sold, when I made the choice to leave everything behind, I realized what I had been holding on to wasn't real. I had to step away from the lies." The interviewer nodded, as if processing the weight of what Nancy had said. Ava gave her a small smile, her hand resting on Nancy's, and Nancy turned to her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. Ava spoke then, her voice steady but soft. "We're just trying to make a life for ourselves. We don't want to be part of the story they wrote for us. We're telling our own story now." The documentary, titled Not Just a Roof, was picked up by a mid-sized platform with a niche following. Within hours of being posted, clips started circulating across social media. The words generational trauma and toxic family dynamics became keywords. And suddenly, people began responding in ways Nancy hadn't expected. The video clips went semi-viral. Thousands of people shared their stories about family betrayals, about toxic environments, about the deep pain of being trapped in a life they didn't choose. Nancy sat at her kitchen table a few days later, scrolling through the influx of comments. She had expected criticism, maybe even mockery, but what she saw instead were messages of support and solidarity from strangers. Her heart tightened with emotion as she read comment after comment. "This is me too. I've lived this. I finally walked away. I feel like you're speaking for me. Thank you for sharing your story. I never thought it was possible to break free, but you showed me it is." It wasn't just social media buzz. It was real connection. People related to her in a way that was raw and honest. And Nancy realized for the first time that her story wasn't just about her. It was about the quiet courage of every person who had ever made the hard choice to leave. Then came the letters. Handwritten, personal, and raw. 3 women, complete strangers, had written to her. Each one shared their story of walking away from a controlling, suffocating family, of losing everything to find themselves. The first letter arrived in a small envelope. Nancy held it in her hands for a long time before she opened it. The words were simple, but the weight of them was immense. "I see you, I hear you, and I'm not afraid anymore." Ava read the letters aloud as they sat together at the dinner table that evening, her voice breaking only once when she read the last letter. "You showed me it's okay to say no. You showed me that I deserve better. Thank you for being brave enough to show the rest of us that it's possible." Ava paused, looking up at Nancy. "Mom, I don't know how you did it." Nancy wiped away a silent tear, her heart heavy with a mix of sorrow and pride. "I didn't do it alone, sweetheart. You were with me every step of the way." As the words settled in the room, Nancy's mind was already swirling with the next step. She wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The next day, Whitney posted a new story. This time, there were no comments allowed. Her words were bitter, full of blame. "We were set up," she wrote. "The truth was never told. The narrative was manipulated to make us look bad." Nancy's heart sank as she read it. But this time, it didn't matter. Whitney's words had no power over her anymore. Nancy smiled softly to herself. Knowing the truth didn't need to be told by anyone else, she had already found it. And that was all she needed. Nancy sat in the dimly lit living room, her eyes glued to the screen. The footage from the party was playing again. The footage that had been recorded by an anonymous guest. The one that had captured the moment everything changed. She had seen it before, but this time, as the video ran, she felt something different in her chest. It wasn't anger, it wasn't regret, it was finality. The camera zoomed in on the chaos outside the house, just beyond the door. Whitney's voice echoed through the frame, harsh, frantic, unmistakable. "You can't do this. You can't just throw me out like this." Nancy watched as her younger self stood calmly in the frame, holding the keys, her posture steady, her voice unwavering. "I'm not throwing you out, Whitney. I'm just closing the door." Whitney's voice grew louder, desperate. "You're ruining everything. This was supposed to be our house, Nancy. How could you do this?" But Nancy didn't flinch. She didn't say another word in the video. She just stood there, waiting for Whitney's words to fall away. The calm contrast between them, the quiet, steady resolve in Nancy's posture, the rage in Whitney's, was undeniable. The camera lingered on Cameron, standing by the door, his hands shoved into his pockets. His eyes were cast down, his face tight with tension. He looked like someone caught in the middle, someone unwilling to choose sides. But there was no mistaking the silence in his actions. He did nothing. He said nothing. The video cut to black. Nancy exhaled, blinking rapidly. It was done. There was no denying it now. This wasn't a family torn apart by misunderstandings or accusations. This was a moment of pure, unfiltered truth. The internet erupted as the footage made its way to social media. In a matter of hours, the video spread like wildfire. People who had no idea who Nancy or Whitney were began commenting, offering their opinions on the chaos that had unfolded. The comments came in waves, some defending Whitney, others taking Nancy's side. Even people who don't like elders, one comment read, are saying, "That's cold." Nancy read the comments from the comfort of her small apartment, her heart beating steadily. The sympathy, the understanding, it was overwhelming in its authenticity. There were no more attacks, no more accusations. People understood what had happened, what had been done to her, and they were offering their support. It wasn't just the people who had known her that responded. Even the ones who had no connection to her life, to her family, were taking sides. The local paper in Scottsdale ran a headline: "Scottsdale woman sells house out from under ungrateful family." It wasn't a hit piece, but a blunt assessment of the situation. The tone was almost too factual, almost too neutral. But for Nancy, it felt like one last victory. There was nothing to hide anymore. The house was gone. The ties were severed. She didn't need anyone's approval or understanding. A few days later, the publisher's email arrived with an offer she'd been expecting for weeks. They wanted her to write a book, a memoir of sorts, detailing the entire saga. It was tempting. The idea of having her story immortalized, of capturing the journey she'd been on from start to finish, was appealing. But something inside Nancy resisted. She stared at the email for a long time before clicking the reply button. She typed only a few words before hitting send. This story's already finished. She didn't need to write it down. She had lived it. And now she was ready to move forward without looking back. A few days later, Nancy and Ava sat in the kitchen, the light from the window casting shadows over their plates. They had made it through the worst of it: the house, the family, the lies. Now there was a quiet peace between them, a peace that came from knowing the hardest parts were over. Ava looked at her mom, a hint of a smile playing at the edges of her lips. "You did it," she said quietly. "You really did it." Nancy leaned back in her chair, her eyes softening as she looked at Ava. "We did it. Together." And that was enough. Later that evening, Whitney posted another story. The video was short, full of venom and bitterness. "We were set up," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "You can't tell my side of the story. The truth is..." Nancy didn't need to hear it. She didn't need to look at the screen anymore. She had already moved on. And this was just noise. Her past was finally behind her. And nothing, not even Whitney's last-ditch efforts, could change that. Nancy stood up from the table and walked toward the window, her heart light. This was her life now. And for the first time, she was truly free. Ava stepped up to the podium, her hands steady, her back straight. The panel on housing equity was an opportunity, but it felt like more than that. It felt like a responsibility. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for the countless families caught in a system that refused to see them. Behind her, the projector flickered to life, showing slides of stark statistics: empty homes, rising rents, the growing divide between those who had a roof over their heads and those who didn't. The audience, a mix of professionals and activists, shifted in their seats as Ava spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. "Couches aren't bedrooms. Parents aren't burdens," Ava said, her words cutting through the noise of the conference room. She didn't need to look at her notes. She knew this, felt this in her bones. She knew the weight of these words. They were more than just a statement. They were her truth. A small murmur rippled through the crowd. Ava didn't falter. When we think of caregiving, we often think of it as a task we have to do, an obligation. But it's not about obligation. It's about love. It's about respect. It's about making space for the people who raised us, who cared for us, without casting them aside when they need us most. The room fell silent for a beat. And then, a few people began to nod. Ava could feel their eyes on her. She knew she had their attention. For the first time, it felt like she wasn't just speaking into the void. At home, Nancy watched the live stream on her phone, her heart swelling with pride. Ava's words were bold, unapologetic. She wasn't just advocating for others. She was speaking for herself, for Nancy, for the life they'd fought to rebuild. The camera cut back to Ava, who stood confidently, her hand resting on the podium. The words were trending almost immediately, spreading like wildfire on social media. A clip of her statement went viral, and the comment sections were filled with praise. "She's right," one comment said. "Parents deserve dignity, not to be shoved into a corner." "She's got it. Parents aren't burdens. We need to create space for them." Nancy couldn't help but smile. She had watched her daughter grow into someone who wasn't afraid to speak out, to take a stand, even when it felt impossible. The phone buzzed beside her, pulling Nancy from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was an email from Brent. His words were as cold as expected. "You've said enough." Nancy stared at the message for a moment before typing a simple response. "You still haven't said anything." She pressed send without another thought. There was nothing more to be said. Brent's silence spoke volumes. The next day, Whitney's efforts to regain control were apparent. She had applied for a home loan, trying to rebuild the semblance of a life she had lost. Nancy heard about it through local circles, but the news wasn't good. Whitney's application had been denied. It was a blow, one more piece of evidence that the life she'd once built was no longer possible. Nancy felt a small knot of satisfaction tighten in her chest. Whitney's reality was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The house was gone. The image of a perfect life was shattered. Whitney's world had been built on lies, and now it was collapsing under its own weight. Later that week, Cameron moved out. Nancy didn't ask why. She didn't press for answers. She didn't need to. Cameron had been living in a state of quiet departure for weeks, and now it seemed he had finally made the choice. Whether temporary or permanent, it didn't matter. It was another loss, another piece of their fractured family drifting away. Nancy heard him gather his things quietly in the middle of the night. His footsteps, soft and deliberate, echoed in the silence. When he was gone, the house felt emptier, but it was a silence Nancy was learning to accept. She didn't need to fill the space with unanswered questions. As she sat in the stillness, she realized that she didn't need him there to be whole. He had made his choices, just as she had made hers, and she was finally free. Nancy stood by the window, her gaze on the city lights below. For the first time in years, the weight of the past was lifting. Ava's voice, echoing with truth and courage, had made all the difference. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Together, they had found their way out of the darkness. And for Nancy, that was enough. The story wasn't over, it was just beginning. Nancy sat at the desk in her new office, a small but bright room in the back of the community center. The walls were adorned with simple art, prints of sunsets and cityscapes, and the space was filled with the quiet hum of purpose. Today was different. Today, the Webb Housing Grant officially launched. The matching funds from the sale had been transferred, and Nancy had poured every ounce of herself into creating a platform that would help displaced seniors. The website, nogarageseats.org, was a reflection of that. With the click of a button, Nancy published the site. The homepage greeted visitors with a simple message. Everyone deserves a roof over their head, especially those who've given us everything. Below, a series of anonymized stories began to roll, each one a heartbreaking tale of elder neglect. But it wasn't just a page of sadness. Nancy had included what she called revenge one-liners, short statements from people who had made the hard choice to take back their independence. Lines like, "I'd rather sleep in my car than in their garage," and "You may have thrown me out, but I'll be the one leaving you behind." It wasn't a crusade for anger. It was a rebellion for dignity. Nancy had crafted every word carefully, knowing that the people reading these stories would find a sliver of themselves in each one. The power of the stories wasn't in the details, but in the universal truths they revealed, that everyone, no matter their age, deserved respect. Within hours, the website had gone viral. Estate lawyers, elder advocates, and social media influencers had picked up the link, sharing it with a fervor Nancy hadn't expected. The stories resonated, and the one-liners made it personal. People were sharing their own experiences, commenting, and donating. Nancy watched the donations roll in, a quiet smile on her lips. This was what she had been building toward all along. The feedback was overwhelming. People were reaching out, wanting to help, wanting to share their own stories. It was more than she could have ever imagined. Ava sat next to her at the desk, watching the numbers climb as well. She was still processing the fellowship offer she'd received just days before. The university had sent an official letter, an offer to study social justice work, particularly around elder care, with a fellowship that would pay for her education and travel. It was an incredible opportunity, but it meant leaving for a while. Ava looked up from her phone, her eyes a mix of excitement and doubt. I don't know, Mom. It feels like everything's moving so fast. Are you sure you're okay with me going? Nancy turned to her daughter, her face soft but resolute. Ava, this is your chance. You've worked so hard, and this is the next step for you. I'll be just fine here. I need you to take it. Ava hesitated for a moment before nodding. I'll take it. I'll figure out how to make it work. You're sure, right? Nancy smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Of course I'm sure. This is your path now, and you're going to do amazing things. I'll be here, doing what I love. We're both on our way. Later that night, Ava's phone buzzed again. She didn't have to look at the screen to know who it was. Whitney's name flashed in the notification. Ava opened the text with a sigh, already anticipating what it would say. So she really cut us out. Whitney's message was simple, but the bitterness behind it was unmistakable. Ava read the message and didn't hesitate. She typed back, the words cold but final. Completely. She put the phone down, not waiting for a response. She had long ago stopped feeling responsible for smoothing things over. Whitney had made her choices, and Ava had made hers. Nancy sat by the window, watching the last light of day fade over the city. The weight of everything she had built settled in her chest, a sense of peace unlike anything she'd felt before. It wasn't just the money or the success of the website. It was the realization that she had finally taken control. The past was behind her. She had let go of the people who had tried to manipulate and control her. She had created something lasting, something that mattered. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from one of the donors, a simple note that read, "Thank you for giving us a voice. My mom was treated like a burden, but now I see there's hope." Tears welled in Nancy's eyes as she read it. She wasn't just helping people find shelter. She was helping them reclaim their dignity, their voice. The future was hers to shape, and for the first time, she felt like she had finally found her place in it. As she stood, stretching out the tension in her muscles, she realized she was ready. She wasn't looking back anymore. The grant was just the beginning. The world was waiting. Nancy's fingers hovered over the photo, a snapshot from the days before it all fell apart. It was an old picture, one taken at a family gathering, the smiles frozen in time. Whitney's arm draped over Nancy's shoulders, an expression of forced warmth plastered on both their faces. It had been one of those moments, years ago, when they were still trying to pretend everything was perfect. But perfection was a lie, and this photo proved nothing. For a moment, Nancy just stared at it, her heart heavy with the weight of what had been. She had carried this image with her for so long, a reminder of the woman she used to trust, the family she thought she had. But now, looking at it, she felt nothing but coldness. This photo didn't tell the truth of what had happened. It didn't capture the betrayals, the manipulation, or the years of silence between them. Without a second thought, Nancy dropped it into the trash, the sound of it crinkling in the bin as it landed. It felt final. It felt right. But then, just as quickly, she reached into the trash can, her fingers brushing against the edges of the photo. She pulled it back out, holding it in her hand again. There was something still tethering her to it, some last tiny flicker of hope she couldn't quite let go of. It was absurd, she knew that, but she couldn't stop herself. Nancy didn't think twice. She grabbed an envelope, slipped the photo inside, and sealed it. She scrawled Whitney's P.O. Box address on the front, her handwriting careful but firm. She had done everything she could. This photo didn't mean anything anymore, but sending it out felt like one last necessary gesture. She wasn't going to let it sit in her house anymore. She wasn't going to let it have any more power. A few days later, Ava returned from her first conference, her eyes alight with excitement as she entered the door, carrying the weight of the experience with her. Nancy stood by the window, her back to her daughter for just a moment, feeling the soft warmth of the sun on her skin. Ava launched into her stories as she dropped her bag on the couch. Mom, it was incredible. I heard from people who've been fighting for change in elder care for decades. They're pushing for policies that actually make a difference. I'm not just talking about temporary fixes, but real change. It's like I'm finally in the right place, and I can be a part of it. Nancy turned, her heart swelling with pride as she listened. Ava had always been a quiet force, and now, seeing her step into her own power was everything Nancy had ever wanted for her. "I knew you'd be amazing at this," she said softly. Ava smiled, sitting down beside her. "I'm glad you think so." The next day, word spread that Cameron had left Whitney. It was a ripple at first, whispered in local circles, then picked up by the gossip mill. Nancy didn't need to hear it firsthand. She already knew. There was a kind of relief in the silence between them. Cameron's departure wasn't a victory, but it was another step in the unraveling of the illusion Whitney had built. She didn't need to know the details. It was clear that Cameron had finally recognized the truth of their situation, even if it had taken him longer than it should have. Whitney, though, wouldn't be able to hide behind her image anymore. She had lost everything, and that fact was spreading faster than she could control it. Mother's Day came around, and with it, another attempt from Whitney to reach out. Nancy's phone buzzed with a notification from Instagram, a post from Whitney. The caption was saccharine, dripping with nostalgia. "Happy Mother's Day to the one who gave me everything," it read. The picture that accompanied it was an old one. Too, another forced smile, another image of a family pretending to be whole. The words were enough to make Nancy's stomach turn. Ava looked over at her phone, her face hardening. "She tagged you." Nancy felt her pulse quicken. She knew exactly where this was going. Whitney was still trying to manipulate the narrative. She was still trying to play the victim, to paint herself as the one who had been wronged. Ava was already typing on her own phone, her fingers flying across the screen. Within moments, she had reported the post. Instagram's message popped up, confirming that it had been taken down. Ava handed the phone to Nancy, her expression neutral. "It's done." Nancy's lips pressed together as she stared at the screen, the familiar wave of anger and frustration rising in her chest. But then it faded. Whitney had no control anymore. Her efforts to maintain her version of the past, to manipulate the narrative, none of it mattered. Nancy smiled softly, a quiet sense of peace settling in. "It's done," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Ava met her gaze, her eyes clear and resolute. "We're free, Mom." The photo, the post. It didn't matter anymore. The past was slipping further away with every day. The future was theirs to create, and nothing would stand in their way. Nancy didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The world ahead of them was waiting. Nancy stood on the porch of the house one last time, the soft evening light casting long shadows across the overgrown garden. The roses, still vibrant, were a silent testament to the years she had spent tending them. The home, once so full of life, now felt empty, but not in the way it had before. This was different. This was freedom. The new owners were waiting inside, the couple standing on the porch with warm smiles, their eyes curious but kind. The man's voice broke the silence. "We kept the roses. They're the best part of the garden." Nancy smiled, the years of hard work on those roses flashing in her mind. They had bloomed for every important moment, for every season of change. And now they would bloom again, but this time, for someone else. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Instead, she stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the rosebush, the soft petals still holding the scent of summers past. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small card, the note she had written weeks ago. Without a word, she handed it to the new owners. "This place was built with more than money," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "Treat it that way." The couple exchanged a glance but didn't question her. They simply took the card, their expressions shifting to something like respect. Nancy turned away, taking one last look at the house. It was done. The chapter had ended, and she had walked away. The past, with its painful memories and broken ties, was finally behind her. Back at her new condo, the summer air was warm and welcoming as Nancy and Ava baked together in the small kitchen. The space was modest, but it was theirs. The scent of sugar and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the laughter that came naturally when they were together. Ava's absence had left a hole in their routine, but now, with her back for the summer, it felt like the house had come alive again. The bond they shared was stronger than ever, a testament to everything they had endured and overcome. As they prepared the dough, Ava smiled at her mother, her eyes soft with affection. "You know," Ava said, her voice casual but with an edge of wonder, "I don't think I've ever been this content. I didn't realize how much I missed baking with you." Nancy smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair from Ava's face. "Me too. It's good to have you home." They worked in quiet companionship, the past no longer weighing on them. With every turn of the spoon, every measure of flour, Nancy could feel the shift inside herself. She had moved on. They both had. A few days later, Nancy made her final preparations. The small yet carefully crafted will she had spent weeks thinking over was ready, and she took it to Kara's office, where the documents would be stored securely. The simplicity of it was almost startling, but it was exactly how Nancy had wanted it. There was one last paragraph, a testament to her quiet defiance. It read, "They gave me a chair in the garage. I gave myself a front row seat to their downfall." The words were an echo of everything she had been through, the hurt, the lies, the manipulation. But they were also a declaration of victory, a reminder that she had finally taken control of her life. The house had been theirs for the taking, but Nancy had sold it on her own terms. Kara, as always, gave her a knowing look when Nancy handed over the will. There was no need for more words. Nancy had said everything she needed to say. Back at her condo, Nancy stood in front of the small patch of earth outside, a new rose bush in hand. She knelt in the soil, her fingers sinking into the rich earth. This was her space now. No more garage, no more being hidden away in the shadows. She planted the rose bush with care, the petals already soft and ready to bloom. There was no plaque, no inscription. It didn't need one. This rose, like the others she had planted over the years, was for her, for Ava, for everything they had built. As she stood, wiping the dirt from her hands, she looked at the condo around her, at the small space that was now home. No more pretending. No more living in someone else's shadow. Her phone buzzed on the table inside, the message from Ava still visible on the screen. Nancy hesitated for just a moment before walking inside to read it. Ava had sent a picture from her trip, a snapshot of a new policy proposal that had passed. It was a small victory, but for Ava, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Nancy smiled softly, her fingers brushing over the photo. The world was waiting, and this time, she wasn't looking back. Later that evening, a final message arrived, this time from Whitney, a long text sent without warning. It was Mother's Day, and despite everything, Whitney was trying again to latch onto the past. Her words were dripping with nostalgia. "I didn't want it to end this way. I tried to make it work. You were my family. You're still my family, right?" Nancy's fingers hovered over the reply box for a moment. Then she set the phone down. It didn't matter. She had made her peace, and the house they never earned was no longer her problem. She picked up the roses, one by one, from the windowsill. They were for her, for Ava. For all the moments ahead that would finally be hers. The future, like the flowers, was beginning to bloom.